So there we go. Today we have Jack Hennessy with us. If you guys have read Deer and Deer Hunting, and you better be reading Deer and Deer Hunting, you're going to see his column. He's been doing this for a couple of years. We call it the Recipe of the Month. It's in the Butcher Shop column of the magazine, and I've learned a lot from it. I'm not bragging, but that's saying something because this man knows his venison. Jack, welcome to the program, Deer Talk Now.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
I find your background pretty fascinating. You grew up southern suburbs of Chicago. You lived out, I think, out in Spokane, Washington for a while. You're in Wichita now. You weren't a hunter from the very beginning, were you?
No, I didn't start hunting until I went to graduate school. I turned about 27 when I was my first hunting season.
So you had no
So,
family, no deer hunters in your family or background at all?
no, my dad and I fished, and that was our extent of outdoors and cooking what we brought home. But no hunting. As far as I know, I didn't know anybody that hunted
So
going
how
to
did,
school
how did
with.
that change for you once you got into graduate school?
It was just meeting folks out there that had lived out there that hunted, um, and they provided some insight. And there was also the stories I was reading from some of these writers. Tom Franklin was one of them, and just he grew up hunting, and he had just more or less these fictional mystery stories that revolved around either deer hunting or turkey hunting, and there was just this allure and something intangible to it. So I became interested in it, and I've always liked to cook. So that the concept of earning what you were putting in the freezer or the fridge was something that also appealed to me. So just talked to some folks there. Whether they grew up hunting or they knew folks who did, and just kind of met folks and took hunter safety. And one year, every year is usually something different. So at first it was turkey, and then it was ducks, and then I got into steelhead, little southeast Washington state there. And so something new every year
Did
based on budgets.
did you do any deer hunting out there?
I tried. I started off with bow, not too successful. I mean, you guys know this. Like you, you learn as you go, unless you have somebody that's really there that knows. So I made, let's say, many mistakes before I started to not make mistakes. But I made most of my mistakes out there.
So how is that today? I know this is years ago when you first started.
Uh,
Has deer hunting grown on you obviously more?
Yeah, I get out more. I'd like to say I'm a successful bow hunter, but I've more or less hung up the bow. I'm a rifle hunter, and part of the reason that is I have a bird dog. I hunt birds. I hunt ducks, geese, quail, pheasant here in Kansas. So it's managing that time, balancing the time with the dog, and also balancing time in the woods. And I just bow hunting in general. I just don't have as much time. So rifle success rate a little bit higher where I go in terms it's a heavy wooded grove area. So yeah,
So
I've
we're gonna get.
gotten more.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry.
We're gonna
No,
get.
it's
Go ahead. Sorry.
no, it's gotten better this year. More deer and more experience. So it's been great.
We're gonna get into this more, but this is the thing. Like I said, if you guys have read this, this is our brand new issue. Jack's got one in here called Venison Meatballs and Korean Cranberry Sauce. It's just you look at his photography is amazing. You look at these dishes and they're not that complicated. One thing, here's another one. This one I have to try this fall because everybody's talked about it. It's kind of, I don't want to say cliche, but it's kind of trendy. Caul fat wrapped grilled venison heart. I've had a lot of venison heart in my life. My brother normally would he'd either pickle it or he'd boil it and cut it into sandwiches. That was kind of like a opening weekend thing we used to do. But if you
Yeah.
guys have seen this, Jack uses, and I have to tell you, Jack, I don't know if I've shared this. I've had so many deer and deer hunting readers say that they cut these out, and one guy said he built a special recipe box to put the recipes
Oh wow,
in. He glues them
that's
onto
awesome.
cardboard bases so they can use these again. But if you look at these recipes, it's almost delicate cuisine, but simple. And I think anybody can do it, but it's ingredients that not most people are using. You're using wines and sauces and different things. How did you get into the whole foodie aspect of not just venison, but wild game in general?
I've worked in restaurants since I was 15, whether it was a pizzeria down in Chicago, Aurelio's, and then an Italian restaurant, Chow's Ristorante, as a senior in high school, and then a little bit of cooking in college, and then after graduate school, I worked at the Elk Public House in Spokane for 4 years. So I've always had a passion for cooking, and it was a challenge. The first time I shot a turkey and I tried to roast it like I would at Thanksgiving, and that just did not work. So it was just the challenge aspect in general, from the front side of getting the animal to the other side of it, making it taste good. So it was so that's like the challenge in general, and it's different. Then eventually you tune your taste buds, and things that used to taste good, chicken for example, doesn't taste as good because you've had something that your flavor, your taste buds are supposed to have. Like we weren't meant to eat the domestic raised animals in the store. So as we eat more wild game, we start to appreciate there's a deeper depth to flavor out there, and that's what I've been enjoying as I go along. So
How do you find that with venison compared to like the beefs and the things that you've been eating all your life?
yeah, it's venison. I enjoy venison more than I do beef now. I wouldn't have said that within the first couple of years, I don't think. Part of that may be that the recipe refinement's been a little more dialed in, but also I still believe it's you're tuning your taste buds into the way you're supposed to eat. Um, I'll give you an example. Like if you get farm raised venison, I've worked with some clients for photography. We'll send the farm raised venison. Maybe it's from New Zealand, and you eat that compared to something that you get out of a soybean field here in Kansas. Completely different. It's just so it's bland from New Zealand, whereas the one here is just it's got far more personality, and it's so all these sauces and stuff are meant to complement that. Like I'm not normally not going to recommend a marinade for some of these cuts, like your hind quarter or your back strap. Like you want to taste it the way it's supposed to taste. If you want to complement it with a sauce on the side, that's one way you can go.
That's really a good point that you make, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I've been eating venison, as everybody probably knows, exclusively for well over 25 years. Yes, I will still eat a Culver's hamburger, but when I eat a Culver's hamburger and then I make one at home with my venison, which I think I've got dialed in, and I want to ask you about your opinions on that. But
Yeah,
I cannot I cannot compare a beef hamburger to a venison hamburger any day of the week because venison is just got it is that flavor that I've become accustomed to.
yeah,
But one thing that I get, and I wanted to ask you, Jack, is I've got some ways that I've done it, but it's actually I took these questions from some Twitter followers.
sure.
So, Jack, what is the
Sure.
key to a good venison hamburger?
Well, to start, it's 100% venison, not cutting it with bacon, not cutting it with any sort of fat or beef. Uh, and then you want it thick enough to where you can cook it to medium rare. So that means at least 6 ounces evenly through the patty. You may want to go as much as 8 ounces if you think that there's a chance that you could overcook it. And hot and fast, I think these days I'm pulling it directly from the fridge. So whereas some cuts I may let sit out at room temperature for upwards of 2 hours, with a hamburger, the patty's formed, it's salt and peppered on each side, maybe a couple hours ahead of time. That's another thing in terms of seasoning. You don't want anything past salt and pepper. And I would recommend usually cooking it on a flat top or a skillet, hot and fast. That skillet 600 degrees, flat top 600 degrees for approximately 2 minutes each side.
What
Letting it rest for
about people who like to make a burger on the grill? You don't recommend that?
You can if the grill is hot and clean. So the real trouble you can run into if the grill's not hot, if it's not clean, venison 100% is so lean, it could stick, it could fall apart. But if it's clean, if it's hot, you're going to develop that crust on the underside. So you're going to flip it no problem. Another thing you can do, which I would recommend on either the skillet or the grill, is take some cooking spray and spray both sides.
Excellent, excellent ideas. I did not know that about your temperature because I wanted to ask you that because I know on beef it's different, but that's really hot on a flat skillet, 600 degrees fast, and that's basically searing in those juices then, right?
To a certain extent, I think there's some mixed feelings in terms of if a sear is going to keep juices in. Some people say, some cooks will say, chefs will say, no, it doesn't. The logic is you're developing that crust, And I think with anything you're trying to cook in terms of medium rare venison, you want to minimize the layer of gray on the outside. That layer of gray on the outside is overdone. That's well done meat right there. So if you do it hot and fast in that scenario, you're going to get that thin layer around the edge, but ideally you're going to have more of the pink in the middle throughout. So the texture balance should be crust on the outside, maybe a little bit of gray, and then that medium rare burger in the middle.
And obviously, you're really not having to worry about internal temperatures when you're dealing with something that hot and that I don't want to say thin, but it's like you said, it's been in the fridge, it's thawed out, it's not frozen.
Right. Yes. Yes. It should be thawed out. That's a good point. It should be thawed out fully in the fridge. And venison, I would say anything past 135 for some of these cuts is you're exponentially losing flavor potential at that point.
So you're not having to worry about the 160 degrees that they say for everything else.
No, no, not at all. Um, I wouldn't say for any cut of venison. I mean, even the front shoulder, which I would recommend, your tougher cuts, low and slow, to where it breaks down. The reason that you go longer and you get higher temps for that, because it's so riddled with collagen, and collagen starts to break down. I think 160, 180. So you give it more time, low and slow, and that collagen turns to gel, and that adds a little bit moisture into the meat. But it's not so much of food safety; it's just the fact that you want that collagen to melt in those tougher cuts. But your more tender cuts, backstrap, hindquarters, and then grind in general is, yeah, I'd say target 130, 135.
Excellent advice. I never even thought about the collagen aspect. I knew that that was the case, low and slow, like on a shoulder, something in
Yep,
that crock pot that you thought, oh man, this stuff's going to be super dry, and it's not. It's just
yep.
delicious at the end of the day. Let's stay on that for a second as far as the cooking temperatures and procedures. What is this is another question from, and I didn't write you guys' names down, sorry, but one guy asked, is particularly linked to steaks and backstrap on the grill. How can I cook it so it's tender?
In terms of like the backstrap or something off the hindquarter, trying to get
Backstrap
it.
or just a venison steak in general?
Yeah, my favorite method remains the reverse sear. So it's with that you're moving heat so slowly through it. So I don't go higher than 200 degrees for something like that, whether it's a steak or a backstrap. So if you take let's say your average whitetail backstrap in Kansas, 4 pounds, take half of that, 2 pounds. I do recommend an internal meat probe, and we can talk more about that, the reason behind it. But I might put it on a smoker at 160, 180, no higher than 200. I'd say, it could be anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on the temperature. What you want to do is there's a few steps after this. You get it to, I'd try not to go higher than 110. Once 110 in the middle, obviously it's not medium rare yet, it's still underdone, but you're going to reverse sear it. It's going to be the same logic as the burger, hot and fast on a 600, 700 degree surface. 1 minute each side for backstrap if the backstrap is whole. If it's a thick steak, I'd say inch, inch and a half, same logic, about a minute. If it's thinner than that, you may want to go 30, 45 seconds. All you want is a crust. The crust and the hot sear is going to raise it approximately another 10 degrees, and then you're going to let it rest. What people don't realize, and I think people get it wrong a lot of times, they forget about carryover. When that hot exterior is hot, it's still cooking the internal meat. So that internal temp will continue to rise 10 to 15 degrees depending on how long it was on a hot sear and how hot that sear was. That's
Fabulous
just
information. Never knew that. Now, like when you're doing that with let's just go with that backstrap example. 600 degrees. I know my grill doesn't get that hot. You're gonna have to take that onto a flat skillet then.
yeah. So it depends. Yeah, of course, depending on what grill you use. Yeah, I will use a cast iron skillet, and that's a good question because I burned off the seasoning on my skillets multiple times. I think what they say is that the temperature at which the seasoning will boil or burn off is 100 degrees higher than its smoking point, and I don't think that's accurate. I think it's higher than that, but I still have to reapply seasoning a lot of times, and you'll notice that you've burned off the seasoning on any surface if it's white or if it's gray, if it's not that black sheen anymore, you've burned off the seasoning, so you got to reapply it. But you do want something like cast iron, mild steel, and it should be thick that can retain that heat. I think I've gone as high as 800, 900 on one of these grills I
Wow.
have out here. And again, if I don't reseason it, it's going to rust. Spring rolls around, I got to scrape off that rust, reseason it. But I would rather do that over and over and have that crust and have that very minimal gray layer on the meat than to do it low and potentially have more overdone meat encasing the medium rare.
Wow. I don't know. Ian, are you hungry yet?
I'm pretty hungry.
I'm getting pretty. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm eating a burger tonight
What
or.
kind of oils is he using to season his cast iron?
Let's talk about that, Jack. How do you season your cast iron?
Yeah, so I don't get too particular with oils. Like I used to do grapeseed oil. I think if you're gonna do it, try to use a high heat oil. I think grapeseed's up there too, and grapeseed has this sticky nature to it too, so it adheres better. There's the cast iron, the mild steel, it's porous. So at a certain temperature, like those pores are going to open up in the metal, and the oil is going to seep in, and that's what seasoning is. There's the polymerization or a word I'm mispronouncing in the science I don't totally get, but that's how it works. But and sometimes it's just for me, it's what it could be sunflower oil. I buy a lot of that, or it could be peanut oil if I have that on hand. I've even used canola oil. The logic still remains is that you want to still have it hot, re-season it if possible, and then it's going to protect it from rust. It's going to make sure that if you use it again, it's hopefully not going to stick because it has that oil coating.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to knock out these last two, Ian, before I get to the other questions. The last two from my list were you actually answered this one. Best thickness for cooking a steak, I think you said was an inch, inch and a half.
I'd say inch and a half is ideal.
And why is that?
It's just again you if you're gonna add that sear to it, it's gonna there's gonna be a bit of a barrier between that high heat getting to the middle and overcooking it, and a thicker steak you're gonna allow carryover to do more of the job versus the direct heat itself. In terms of the low and slow, starting off at 200 degrees or 160 smoke, that's going to move it through there evenly, no issue. Things get more complicated when you're applying direct high heat. And a thin piece, it's just going to cook. It's going to get well done quicker over high heat.
You're going to get done too quick with a thin one, and if you got a really thick one, it's not going to be consistent.
Well, that's a good question. Like if you're doing like a top round, for example, you want to roast a whole top round. You would potentially want to go higher than 110 in terms of the low and slow smoke because I think at that point you're going to suspect you might raise the internal temp about 5 degrees if you're getting that crust on it, and you may again want to go more than 1 minute on each side. It's a bit of an art at that point to a certain extent, still more science, but I probably would say you may want to go 115, 120 depending on how big of that top round is, and then you apply that crust again over high heat, let it rest for 10 or 15 minutes. So it's just a matter of your starting point. And what I mean by starting point is when do you pull it from the initial step, which is the low smoke or the low roast, and bring to the sear.
Okay, and then the last question on that list was, does soaking venison in something like milk make it more tender?
I don't think you should soak venison in anything. That's doesn't make it. So the logic I think behind that is milk is a mild acid, and funny enough, like when I was living in Spokane before I was killing my own critters, I volunteered a few times at the Union Gospel Mission, and they have a road recovery crew in Eastern Washington that goes out and if a deer gets hit on the side road, these guys try their best to come pick it up, clean it, and drop it off at the men's mission or one of the charities in town where they can serve it to the needy in the community. Or hunters may just donate meat. The chef there would soak his venison in milk, apples, and sugar. And I think to some extent people they think it neutralizes gamey tones. So I think it's for some folks it's less about tenderness, and any perceived tenderness I'd say is slight, if any, and that's in terms of anything. Anytime I soak anything in milk, it's more for the fat if it's a fry, for example. It's more so that the dredge can adhere to the fat in the milk when I fry it. It will tenderize it a little bit, there's, I mean, if you want to tenderize something, you maybe let the meat rest. So if you're going to take a step to tenderize it, let it rest in the fridge for 5, 7 days. If you want to age it or hang it, you can. Again, you run into aging that you may have to discard the outer shell because that meat just gets dry and all candy shell. But I think liquids in general, whether it be water or milk, it's going to suck out some of the innate flavors of it. So in that sense, it's going to reduce the gaminess, but the meat's not going to taste the way it's meant to taste.
Excellent, excellent. I know a lot of guys that, and this is popular, I think, in the South, where they soak their venison in ice water after they kill it. I've seen that. I don't know if they're just trying to cool it or what the deal is there.
Yeah, I think water in general, just especially if it's something from the tap with the different chemicals that are, and depending on what community you're in and what kind of additives are in the water, you're adding that to your meat for one thing, and then water in general. Like, did you guys ever grow up where maybe you had hot dogs boiled in water?
Yeah.
And afterwards you got that hot dog water.
Yep.
Water takes out flavor. So even just a standard wet brine that you might use for a turkey or you might use for a pheasant or a duck, it's going to reduce the innate flavor personality of the meat itself because it's going to suck out some of that some of the juices in there. And plus, if you do it with venison, you end up with something that just doesn't look like venison. It looks more like pork at the end of it. So
it's like whitish gray.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, and that is the same. I agree with you. Like, well, we used to all the time. I shot a lot of rabbits growing up, and the MO there was we'd soak it in salt water overnight. Well, when you pulled that rabbit out, it was almost pure white. At the end of the day. So, okay,
you're sucking out the proteins in the muscle. It's just the liquid proteins are getting pulled into the water itself.
Excellent insights. Okay, on to the other questions. Oh, we talked about that. Let's see here. Okay, these are coming from Ian. When it comes to wild game, we're going to talk about venison specifically. What are your must-have ingredients that you have to have in your kitchen?
Kosher salt, for one. If you can do peppercorns and you have a quality pepper grinder, I like the cracking fresh pepper over. And anytime I can do that, like you have the texture and the more the peppery taste to it versus something that's pre-ground in a tin. That's what I'd recommend. I don't know necessarily if I'd recommend anything like essential past that. I'm trying to think. It does depend on what cut you're cooking though too. So if you're looking at cooking something that needs slow at the front, the shoulder, the neck, or some trim, anything that's not hind quarter, tenderloin, or backstrap, I think you maybe want some liquids of some sort. So if you want some beef stock in the pantry, if you want some chicken stock in the pantry, if you want beer in the fridge, you're gonna want to introduce liquids to something. If you smoke something and you wrap it, you're still going to introduce liquids to it because it's just, you don't want it to dry out in terms of those tougher cuts. The collagen is going to do its job to a certain extent, but not in the same way that it would in a domestic pig shoulder, for example.
Deer Talk Now is brought to you by Full Range Mounting Systems. These mounting systems are a great way to manage all of your mounts in a stylish and organized manner. We are using their pedestal mount here on the podcast set for 2 shoulder mounts, and it looks just awesome. Be sure to check out their mounting systems at fullrangesystems.com, and for 15% off your order, use code DTN. So what's the deal with kosher salt versus regular iodized salt?
This is something I always do have to look up. It's the chemical compound is different too, and the way it's absorbed into the meat. I would say so. The non-iodized or it's table salt, so it's something that's added immediately to kind of open up your taste buds as you're eating it. Whereas kosher salt, it's going to assist with the taste buds, but at the same time, it's going to get absorbed into the meat. Retain moisture to a certain extent. That's another thing. That's how brines work in general. Salt binds to the chemical or the muscle fibers, retains, upwards of 50% more moisture when it cooks. And it's just, I think it just it moves through the meat differently. The chemicals do. And there's a bit of science that's outside my realm, but I do that. And I also sometimes, recently I've started using sea salt, kind of granular sea salt. So if I were to serve something and I were to cut it, even though if I salted it before I smoked it, cooked it, seared it, whatever, if there's a line of backstrap medallions on a plate, I might try to just sprinkle a little bit of sea salt over it. It adds a little bit of crunchy texture, but again, it allows your flavor. Salt opens up the sweeter tone, taste buds. So as that goes on your tongue, you're experiencing more flavor potential because salt is present. I
Excellent.
kind of describe as a key that unlocks all the flavors. One thing is salt.
What about, excuse me, what about the standbys that almost all of us use? Butter, garlic, and onions. How often do you use those?
Oh, great question. Those are both. Yeah, those are. So the great thing, obviously, about onions and garlic is, for the most part, shelf life. It's not non-perishable, but it's far more so than, say, a tomato sitting on the shelf. So great point. I use onions a lot. Use garlic a lot. Garlic, fresh garlic. You peel it, you mince it. If it's going to go in a sauce, or it's going to be something that you're going to potentially, maybe, to your point with butter, maybe do a little bit of a simmer in butter and then rub that garlic butter over the venison. You can do that too. Or that's just something you can serve after you slice the venison. You had this very, very low simmer of butter and garlic, and then you put that over the venison. I'm also a big fan of caramelizing onions in general. I geek out. I have a very, very refined approach to caramelizing onions.
Man, that is, I'm so freaking hungry right now, and I ate breakfast already. But let's talk about some of the most unusual but successful recipes that you made. And I know that's kind of a broad question, but maybe do you have an example of something that you thought going into it that this is going to not work or be too complicated that turned out to be one of your favorite dishes?
Oh, it's always something probably weird. So and I get made fun of this for camp every now and then. Like when I save the oysters, I call them, because the testicles off the bucks. So I'll be the one that asks for them, and if we're at depending on where we're at, somebody's gonna give me a weird look. Like, you mean the balls? So, but and I shared that recipe with you guys, and so that was, they're far more simpler to clean than folks think, and they taste like oysters. They taste like, if you fry them, like, I don't think anybody would be able to tell the difference between a fried oyster from the sea and a fried oyster off a buck. So there's that. But I've had Rocky Mountain oysters, so I kind of had an idea what the texture was going to be, what it was going to taste like. So it was good. Another thing that I did recently was dehydrated some blueberries, turned to a powder, mixed it with coffee, and rubbed down like a French rib rack that I had in the freezer. I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out, but I was pretty impressed with the mix and that spices. I'm trying to think what else there are. There's first time I cooked a neck roast. I didn't really know what to expect, but I just kind of just applied the principles of low and slow. Gave it a sear, a smoke, I think, and put it in a crock pot, and then like the spine just falls out of it.
Oh my
It's just
gosh.
the meat shreds.
That is so. If you've never had a neck roast, listen to what he's saying, because it is probably that, along with the front shoulder, are probably the
Yeah,
most underrated cuts on a deer.
yeah. I honestly don't think there's anything bad that comes off a deer. So I do, when it comes to the liver. I've not dabbled too much in liver. I have tried smoking spleen, kidneys, some of that stuff. I do it and then I give it to the dog. So I can't tell you I have a great recipe for deer spleen.
I've never had it. I think I've eaten deer liver once. That was
Yeah,
when I was young. I mean, we ate chicken livers like every Saturday growing up, but like
yeah.
deer liver, and I know this sounds weird coming from a guy who eats venison every day. Deer liver, I don't know. I just don't go for it. But a spleen, I've never even thought of that. But maybe
I
that's why
forget.
your dogs are eating it.
Yeah, it wasn't. I don't know if I could differentiate between deer liver and spleen at that point. In terms of like the flavor, it seemed similar to me. But it wasn't something I would go back for or try to, like, I wasn't gonna make a pate out of it. Let's just put that that way.
The other thing that we used to make, my dad, rest his soul, he grew up in the Depression, and it was a German name. I don't know if you ever heard of this. It was called Brockaby, and it was basically a blood pudding. And
Okay, yeah, I've heard of it.
and what they would do is they did it with pigs, and they would collect all the blood. Well, I'm not doing it now with the deer, I will tell you that. But they collect all the blood, and they'd mix it with flour. It was just boiling in a cauldron. It was almost like some witch's stew. And then they would pour it in pots and let it cool and then freeze it. And then you'd slice it and you'd fry it. I mean, it was really good, but I don't think I could try that with a deer. I wouldn't recommend eating anything deer blood based like that.
Yeah. I don't know how you would do it when you got the deer in the field, and then the deer's mostly doesn't have a ton of blood left in it when it gets.
It wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be enough.
Yeah.
This episode is also brought to you by Moultrie. Moultrie Mobile's Edge Trail camera is affordable and easy to set up. The camera works on multiple networks nationwide and even has built-in storage. That means no SD card required. For more information, visit moultriemobile.com. Okay, this is actually the last one on the list. Your expertise in both cooking and writing about food have taken you on fascinating culinary journeys. This is very well written, by the way. Could you share an inspiring story from your experiences where you discovered a hidden gem or a recipe from a specific culture or region?
Oh, that's a good question. These are the ones I had to think about, and it's not because it's.
And I should have sent them to you before so you could actually thought about this.
I make a lot of recipes with different things, so I'm trying to go through it. And off the top of my head, I've probably written about 200 recipes at least in the past couple of years. So I'm trying to go through. So my wife and I, and we don't travel a ton, but we like going. If we do travel, we like to go someplace that needs someplace that we haven't been. In terms of it being another culture or not, there's that. My wife has recommended. So I'm trying to think of venison exclusive things. Like we did there was a point where birria tacos were kind of the new trend. This was a few years ago. They're still there. But there was a food truck in California that was talking about how he made birria, and then he was making tacos out of it and putting cheese in it and searing it on a flat top and then dipping those tacos in the birria. So that was, and working with different, whether it be the type of chocolate that they use for the recipe. Well, that was for mole. I'm getting my stuff confused. Mole is another thing that's one I'll come back to after this short story. But it was just the chilies and the cinnamon and the kind of different spices that typical food wouldn't use that I'm used to cooking, and just doing a little bit of research. There's a Mexican grocer south of Wichita that I visited for peppers and stuff, and just working with ingredients that you wouldn't find in most. That's part of the fun of it. And some of these stores, obviously, they have a different atmosphere and personality compared to my Derby Marketplace, Dillon's, or that section.
Sure.
Another one was, again, this goes back to traveling. I had a friend used to work at our ad agency, Matt Whitman, and we went to Utah to visit Barnes Bullets one time, and we stopped. I think it's somewhere in Salt Lake City, and it's I'd have to look it up. It's like Liguana or Iguana something, but they have this. They're famous for the mole, and it's just the chocolate that's in it and the spices, the chilies, and that's the sauce itself. And then you can take that and you can slowly simmer some of your meat. So just the mole sauce with the chilies, and I came up with my own variation of that, which I thought was comparable and quite good. And then also the authentic chili, which is something that, every deer hunter's got their deer chili, right? And some folks will argue that if you got beans in your chili, it's not actually chili, right? So in Texas, I think they call that a bowl of red or Irish red or something. I call it Irish red because they use Irish beer in it. But just not, how do you work with just chilies and meat and make something that you can call chili? And so that's been fun too. Just to a certain extent, looking into the histories of dishes, the cultures behind it. I'm not up to the caliber of some of these folks that get really into the history and the story behind, that part of that comes with writing, 110 recipes a year. You just don't get to sit back and indulge in terms of culture and history, but sometimes you do.
That's pretty cool. I would have to add on your comment about chili, because up here, a lot of people put noodles in their chili, and that's like, to me, it's not chili if there's noodles in it.
Yeah.
That's like chili mac or something. I don't know what you call it, but
Well, you got real chili in Wisconsin. At least we did at the Marquette campus in Milwaukee.
I was going to ask you about that. You're a Marquette alum, aren't you?
Yeah.
I grew up about 20 minutes from there.
Yeah, yeah. So that was the kind of, I didn't go there too often, but I had friends that loved to go there. And real chili was, yes, there's like the thin, small spaghetti noodles mixed in with what they call chili.
Yep.
So yeah, I agree. It's chili mac.
That's chili mac. I do put beans in my chili, but I've actually had, my favorite now is what I guess we call the double meat, where you have the ground meat and then you put in some cubed up venison. That's my favorite. And I actually grew my own. Well, I've been doing it for quite a few years, but I had a really good crop of jalapenos last year. Ian ate them without even flinching.
Oh, wow.
He took whole ones and he was just chomping down on them like they were bananas. And I'm like, but with real jalapenos in there, that was some good stuff. Now I just forgot my train of thought here. But I would agree with you as far as you don't even have to. What I find fascinating, because I don't travel overseas at all, but just within the United States, the different regions, I've met guys from Louisiana and Texas and Georgia and Florida, and, South Carolina. All these guys, they make their venison. You always learn something different, don't you? As far as it's the same deer, it's the same venison, but you're learning different things. But the question for you, Jack, is what's your take on whitetail versus mule deer versus like axis deer?
So my experience is mostly whitetail. I've had a limited amount of mule deer when I was in the Pacific Northwest, and a limited amount of axis deer in the time I've been in Texas. So I can't speak at length to the difference. And admittedly, when I was having the mule deer was when I was living in Spokane. And that's before I had a lot more game that I've cooked. So I can't. I don't know. My innate answer is, the species are different to a certain extent. And I always use this example of when I worked in the restaurant, we got the ground beef fresh from the same cattle company ranch in town. And I would make my burger maybe once a week, just before our lunch rush. And it would taste different. So different animals taste different. It could be come from the same ranch and they could have the same diet, but there's just going to be a different flavor between animal to animal. So in terms of species, it's going to differ to a certain extent, and their diet's going to be different. We talked about in Minnesota, and this, you have your deer that are shot closer to the metro area that are eating corn in a farmer's field versus the ones that are up north in the rifle range that are eating anything they can find on twigs. They call them swamp bucks up there. It's just the diet, and the reason for that is your diet is fat is flavor. So a rooster that's shot in western Kansas is going to be corn fed. It's going to have that yellow line of fat. Going to taste a little bit different than something that's maybe, I don't know, even in southwest Minnesota, potentially.
I would agree with that. As far as whole cuts on venison, as far as burgers, really hard to tell. It's really difficult for me to tell. I would still put axis up there probably at the top if you had to rank those three. Mule deer just, to me, has got a much different flavor. It's good venison, don't get me wrong, but it's more of a red meaty kind of flavor, I guess. I don't even know how to describe that. It's not like the whitetail venison. And I always told people I defy you to tell the difference between an inside tenderloin on a whitetail anywhere, because I can't. It tastes like whitetail venison. I can't tell the difference. But again, I think that might be just eating all venison all the time, that you just kind of get used to it, that you don't, like you said, this is what it's supposed to taste like, and there aren't stark differences. Ian, do you have any other questions?
We're gonna need that birria tacos recipe, and we're gonna need to know how you did that consomme. Like, how'd you make the juice? Like, were you using ancho chilies? Were you using what?
Yeah, it was ancho chilies, guajillo.
Okay.
And I'd have to look again.
That sounds fascinating.
This was one from a few years ago.
Well, we'll post that on a link.
I would say in terms of the grind, which just made me think we were talking about being able to differentiate the flavor. The only time that I feel like grind is different is if someone hasn't taken the time to take off the fascia or the fat, and it's just like that silver skin in there. Like the truth is, like, I kill my own deer, but at the same time, I will call processors and just ask them, like, do you have any leftover grind? Because I would rather eat that than beef. And they can sell me the processing fee, and I can go pick up grind.
Nice.
But I can also tell, like, how in a rush they were sometimes, because when you get that note in a bite, you're like, someone didn't take off the silver skin here, or that's a piece of fascia. So it's not. Some people are like, everything goes in the grind. I would say, if you're doing it yourself, try to trim off anything that's not red meat. Shouldn't go in a grind, is kind of my logic.
100%. That's the way I do it. It's kind of a pain in the butt to do that sometimes, to get that meticulous, but that's where the difference is. And that's, like you said, that's where everybody said, oh, it tastes too gamey. I've had people say, oh, this tastes like acorns because he was, living in the North Woods. Like, no, he didn't. They didn't trim the silver skin off, and they probably threw a bunch of fat in that grind, which some butchers will do because, but if you do it yourself, you can alleviate that. The other thing that I had, I don't want to keep this too much longer, I had success with, I don't do it anymore, but I put it in my book. That's why I'm going to mention it, is we used to put tapioca pearls in the burger, and that was when the burger was ground so, like, just pure venison. And when you tried to make burgers, it was almost difficult because there was nothing to congeal it together. There was no fat in there. And that actually helped, and it gave it a little bit of moisture. But I know some people tried it and they loved it, so I thought I would throw it out there. It's not a very common tactic, but that's something that I've used.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Okay, well, Jack, thank you very much for joining us. We very much appreciate it. His name is Jack Hennessy. You can read his stuff all over the web, and we're going to give you his handle here in a second. But Deer and Deer Hunting Magazine, every issue, it's in the back of the Butcher Shop column. Butcher Shop column talks about processing, making venison, science of venison, and Jack's columns are in there in every single issue. I believe your handle on Instagram is at Wild Game Jack.
Correct.
And where else are there other places where people can find your work?
There's brazenthewild.com, which is my blog, which I haven't updated in many years, but I still pay for the domain name. And then the Facebook is Brazen the Wild. Sometimes there'll be stuff on Facebook that isn't on Instagram, but Instagram's the primary one.
Primary places on Instagram and also Facebook. Jack, thank you very much for joining us. We very much appreciate the insights, and I really appreciate everything you've done for deer and deer hunting.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity in the magazine and on this podcast. Appreciate it, Dan.
Absolutely. For Jack Hennessy, I am Dan Schmidt, and for Ian Sanchez. Join us every Thursday for a brand new episode of Deer Talk Now, wherever podcasts are dropped, or if you want to watch the video versions, they are on our YouTube page, which is YouTube.com/DDH Online, and also Facebook and wherever else you're following us on social media. We will catch you next week for another episode of Deer Talk Now. Deer Talk Now is brought to you by 10 Point Crossbow Technologies. Whether I'm in a tree stand, ground blind, or spot and stalk hunting, I know the Nitro 505 is up to any challenge. Check one out at a dealer near you or log on to 10pointcrossbows.com for more information.